You may have seen or heard about some mysterious polio-like illness going on in the western parts of the United States. If you'll give me just a couple of minutes, I'm going to prove to you that polio is a man-made disease. Most people believe polio is a natural disease that started crippling people, often children, around 100 or so years ago. It's actually something very different than we learned about. In fact, we couldn't have gotten the story more wrong if we tried. This isn't because of a purposeful conspiracy or cover-up or anything like that, by the way. I don't believe we've been lied to by pharmaceutical criminals trying to make millions of dollars from our ignorance or fear. The problem is we started telling a particular story before we understood what was actually happening. Humans do that when they're scared. Fables, or fairy tales, we might call them. We now know what actually happened, but never bothered to go back and fix the original version. In all the panic around the paralysis and trying to get a vaccine developed, we missed what was actually happening and never went back to correct our mistakes. I've been researching the polio story for a long time and was amazed with how wrong we'd gotten the story. First thing to understand, before the 1800s, polio did not exist. No one had ever heard of it. No one had ever heard of a healthy child waking up one morning paralyzed. You can look through medical histories and you just don't see anything about it. There's an old Egyptian painting that depicts someone with a deformed leg resembling paralysis that had occurred in their youth. There's one or two stories from the 1700s that might have been polio. That's all. But in the late 1800s, we started to see this kind of thing pop up here and there. It increased as we neared the 1900s and really started taking off up until 1952, the year polio seemed to peak in the U.S. If a disease suddenly appears and starts hurting lots of people, one of three things happened. Our genes changed, the microbe changed, or something in the environment changed. It can only be one or more of those things. Our genetic makeup changed, the virus or bacteria mutated into something new and more dangerous, or something in the environment changed. How about genetics? Can our genes change in a way that makes us more susceptible to a virus? Well, sort of. Everyone's different. Some people may have been born with more protection from a particular virus, while others have less. We all inherit and develop differences in our immune system, our gut, our million other components of our body. It's generally thought that you are born with a genetic blueprint that determines everything about you from the day you are conceived, but that notion is being challenged by current epigenetic research. Regardless, for thousands or possibly hundreds of thousands of people to all inherit or express the same genetic shift at the same time in many different countries on separate continents around the world, that doesn't seem possible, does it? If we're trying to determine if changing genetics, changing microbes, or a changing environment is what caused the appearance of polio, genetics doesn't sound like a possible explanation to me. What about microbes? There are instances of microbes changing and causing problems. Now, occasionally an animal virus like SIV will cross over into humans, turn into HIV, and cause real problems. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something like the influenza virus, the thing that causes the flu. It changes all the time, constantly, not once a year. One reason, by the way, the flu shot doesn't work very good, even when they guess the right strain. Every once in a blue moon, it changes into something really nasty, and suddenly a routine flu infection can become especially dangerous. That's what happened with the Spanish flu in 1918. It was terrible. Millions of people died. Thankfully, we don't see many microbes suddenly mutate out of the blue and start harming humans besides the influenza virus. You might be thinking, well, maybe the polio virus did do something unusual. Maybe it did mutate quickly, and that's why people started getting paralyzed from a previously harmless virus. Here's the problem. There are actually 3 different types of poliovirus, and none of them appeared to cause paralysis in human beings until late in the 1800s. But then all 3 of them started causing problems. at the same time. I might believe that one poliovirus suddenly mutated, but for all three polioviruses to suddenly mutate at the same time in such a way they cause the exact same problem, paralysis, I can't believe that's what happened. Can you? That leaves us with an environmental cause. Environmental basically means man-made. If polio wasn't because of genetics, because so many people started getting infected at the same time in different countries, and if it wasn't because of mutating viruses, because there are three polioviruses that would have all had to have transformed from harmless to causes paralysis at the same time, then that leaves us with it's man-made. Polio is a man-made disease. But from what? What could we have done that could have possibly caused children to suddenly become paralyzed? Remember that the poliovirus had apparently coexisted peacefully with human beings for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The poliovirus was everywhere. Everyone caught it at some time in their life. We just didn't know about it because its symptoms looked like just another cold. But something changed in the 1800s. Several things changed, actually. A couple of inventions, advancements, and cultural shifts that accidentally turned this innocuous disease into a killer. One of the first problems, cutting-edge medicine of that era developed an obsession with mercury and arsenic as treatments for nearly everything. Babies were given mercury-containing teething powder. Pregnant women with morning sickness were given arsenic to drink, all by well-intentioned, well-educated doctors. You can look through medical guides from that era, and there isn't a single health condition they wouldn't try to fix by prescribing mercury or arsenic. It was everywhere. I can't emphasize it enough. This wasn't some fringe treatment that a few quacks practiced. This was standard medical practice for about any illness you could possibly come down with. At the same time, chemistry really began to come into its own, and they focused much of their newfound discoveries on agriculture, specifically pesticides, chemicals that could be sprayed on fruits, vegetables, even animals to help farmers grow more efficiently with less work and less damaged crops. As it turned out, these pesticides were not good for human health in a number of ways. They didn't know this at the time, and as a result, these new chemicals were sprayed everywhere on nearly everything. They were thought to be completely safe. An especially nasty substance called lead arsenate was created toward the late 1800s and was applied everywhere to help control moths and other critters that were damaging fruit. Lead arsenate is a combination of lead and arsenic and was popular because the poison they'd been using, called Paris green, wouldn't stick to fruits and vegetables very well. You'd have to apply multiple coats of it to maintain protection. This new invention, lead arsenate, on the other hand, stuck really well to whatever you sprayed it on, even after it rained. You can imagine lead arsenate was really popular amongst farmers. Spray it once or twice and it was locked onto their apples and other produce, even after they tried to wash it off. You can imagine this was not good for a child's health. With mercury and arsenic being employed by doctors everywhere, and with lead arsenate and Paris green being sprayed with absolutely no concern for human health on vegetables, fruits, and livestock, you can see why people in the late 1800s began to get sick. By the way, this is why you see a huge spike in sanitariums, asylums, and fainting rooms during this time period. It's all related to the increase in these toxic chemicals everywhere. If any of this sickness involved paralysis, which it often did, they'd call it acute poliomyelitis of the anterior horn, which later became shortened to polio. Something very important was happening at the same time. Animals were also getting polio. They were suddenly coming down with paralysis, often deadly, in the exact same outbreaks as humans. Strange, no? Health officials would send tissue samples of the animals off to laboratories where their spinal cord would be examined under a microscope, and guess what? The labs would confirm it. The animals had polio. But there was a problem. They didn't know it at the time, but animals can't get polio. Towards the end of the 1800s, animals were getting sick from the chemicals just like the humans. They just called it polio. Now, I know what you're thinking. Right now, you're thinking, I'm saying that all along polio was just pesticide poisoning. Certainly, some of what they thought was polio was actually mercury or arsenic or lead arsenate, causing people to become sick, even paralyzed. That was definitely the case with most of the animals, but that wouldn't explain everything. And I want you to understand everything. Remember the 3 different polioviruses? They actually did seem to be capable of causing paralysis. You could inject them into a monkey's spinal cord, and the monkey would most likely develop paralysis. But there was something else that they didn't understand the significance of. And this is really important. One of the most important things to understand. It wasn't just those 3 polioviruses. There were other viruses beside the polio ones. All of them had recently gained the ability to cause paralysis. How? Medical treatments and pesticide spraying were causing everyone, including animals, to become sick, even paralyzed. They called this polio because they didn't understand what was going on. But something else started to happen. The 3 polioviruses actually started to cause problems. They started paralyzing people. Why? The central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord, it's very well protected. It's probably the most protected part of your body. It takes something very uncommon for a virus or bacteria to make its way into your nervous system. You've heard of tetanus, a bacterial infection of the nerves. It takes a deep skin puncture to be able to get into your nervous system. Without that wound, without that path into your nervous system, it's just a harmless bacteria. The same is true for rabies, and the same is true for poliovirus. Harmless outside your body, inside your nervous system, they can be bad. The poliovirus typically lived in your intestines, where you developed immunity to it without even knowing you'd gotten an infection. In a natural state, it's a fairly harmless virus. But something happened that allowed this virus to start making its way into our nervous system, where it could actually do damage. What happened? Why did the poliovirus start paralyzing people in the late 1800s, when it apparently had never done so before? There are 3 main reasons polio is a man-made disease, and I want to go ahead and get 2 of them out of the way. The first one is a strange one. Shots, injections, vaccines. If a deep skin puncture could drive the tetanus bacteria into your nervous system where it might do some damage, the same held true for the poliovirus. Doctors even have a name for it: provocation polio. If you happen to have one of the 3 polioviruses on your skin somewhere, which was common, and you got a shot or a vaccine, it could drive the poliovirus, or a number of other viruses, into your nervous system where it would start to multiply and cause a localized paralysis that could sometimes travel through your nervous system all the way into your spinal column, where it could cause some real problems. Like I said, doctors knew about it and even knew not to give shots during the summer when the poliovirus seemed to be more plentiful. So they'd wait until after summer had passed to administer shots to avoid the risk of provocation polio. Luckily, this wasn't very common, and if you did get polio this way, it was usually localized to the injection site. Not always, but usually. If you see news stories of mystery polio-like paralysis that happen, usually during the fall when every kid is getting their shots for school, it's probably provocation polio. The second reason polio is man-made is really interesting. When they were developing the vaccine for polio, they had a hard time paralyzing the monkeys with the poliovirus. The only way they could reliably do it was to inject the virus directly into their nervous system, which wouldn't help them determine if the vaccine worked, because the body's main defense against polio was in the intestines. Save that for later. It's important. Okay, they were trying to find a way to simulate a more natural infection route. So Albert Sabin, one of the original polio vaccine inventors, removed a monkey's tonsils, then sprayed some poliovirus into its throat. Bam! The monkey got paralyzed. As it turned out, this was a really handy way for causing bulbar polio, the worst kind of polio, the kind that paralyzed your lungs and made it difficult to breathe. Now, Sabin didn't just come up with this method on his own. There were thousands of parents who had been saying their kid became paralyzed with polio directly after their tonsils were taken out. But doctors didn't believe them. After Sabin did some experimenting, it became clear that injured or recently removed tonsils or adenoids gave the poliovirus an easy path into your nervous system. Makes sense when you think about it, especially considering at that time, tonsillectomies were the most common surgery in the United States. They'd take your tonsils out for anything. If you were clumsy, or if you weren't doing well in math, or to prevent arthritis. Everyone's tonsils were being removed, typically during the summer when school was out. Doctors have since come up with the novel idea that perhaps the tonsils were there for a specific reason, even if we don't understand what. But unfortunately, back then, they didn't realize this new procedure, like shots or vaccines, was inadvertently giving the poliovirus a free ride into the nervous system. So those are two of the man-made things that were causing the formerly innocuous poliovirus to paralyze human beings: injections and tonsillectomies. What about the third? The third is the most important because it was causing far more suffering than the other two. If you try to find out why the poliovirus started to paralyze people, you won't get a very good answer. You can look at all the polio history books on the planet, all the medical books, Wikipedia, CDC, or the World Health Organization, and none of them will tell you why. They will say things like, the mechanisms by which poliovirus spreads to the central nervous system are poorly understood, but it appears to be primarily a chance event. That's what Wikipedia says. It's been over 100 years since the poliovirus was discovered, and besides provocation polio and the tonsillectomies, no one seems to have a solid idea why the virus started making its way into people's spinal columns. Because the disease is not a problem anymore, they really don't seem to care. Before I tell you the third and most important reason polio is a man-made disease, I want to address something. A reason people will use to explain why polio started paralyzing people in the late 1800s. We all know that many of the diseases that used to plague humanity, like smallpox, scarlet fever, cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, etc., most of the mortality from these diseases was brought to near zero because of improvements in nutrition, medical care, and sanitation. But interestingly, people will blame improvements in sanitation on the rise in polio. How does that work? Well, it actually makes sense on the surface. The poliovirus is often transmitted in sewage through what is pleasantly referred to as the fecal-oral route. Because the poliovirus lives in your gut, you excrete it when you go to the bathroom. If you live in less than sanitary conditions, you're going to pick up the virus as a kid and develop immunity to it. But in a cleaner environment, you'd probably not be exposed to the poliovirus as a child, but later on in life when you're older. Many people theorize that this is why more people started getting paralyzed from polio, because they lived in cleaner conditions that kept them from getting infected as children. If this doesn't strike you as a little odd, it should. The sanitation argument basically says that people were getting polio infections later in life. It says the average age of infection changed. It went up. And that for some reason, you were more likely to become paralyzed from the virus when you were older than if you had caught it when you were an infant. There are a couple of things that don't support this theory. Early on, it was mostly younger children, not older people, who were getting paralyzed. Secondly, the first polio outbreak recorded in the United States in 1894 Vermont happened in a rural farming community where there had been no change to their sanitation method for 100 years. Nothing that would have upset the fragile balance of natural polio infection timing. Also, the worst polio outbreak in the history of the United States happened in New York City in 1916, a place and time that was not an ideal model of sanitation, if you've ever seen pictures. Let me just say this. Improvements in sanitation could certainly have changed the frequency at which people were exposed to the poliovirus. With improvements in sanitation, they would have been exposed to the virus less often. But that's all it changed. Improved sanitation had nothing to do with the virulence of the virus or the reason it was able to migrate from people's intestines into their spinal cords. Something else did. Something man-made. What was it? If you haven't noticed it yet, let me point out something interesting to you. provocation polio, the polio that you get when the poliovirus is pushed into your nervous system by a shot or injection, the paralysis starts right at the injection site and progresses from there. And with the tonsillectomies, the kind that seem to trigger bulbar polio, the bulbar region of your brain sits directly behind and just above your tonsils. For both of these types of polio, there seems to be a geographical relationship to the point of entry of the virus. Injection site arm, paralysis arm. Tonsillectomy here, paralysis originating here. When you see the geographical relationship of how polio paralyzes, the final and most common cause and route of paralytic polio becomes fairly obvious. We've shown how injections and tonsillectomies can cause polio to paralyze in a geographically correlated area. But provocation polio from injections and bulbar polio from tonsillectomies were the exception and not the norm. How did the poliovirus do most of its damage? If you go look through all the medical history books, they might explain how the poliovirus replicates in motor neurons or damages the motor neurons. But they will never tell you how for sure a fairly innocuous virus like polio started to make its way into the nervous system. They will say, the molecular mechanisms by which poliovirus causes paralytic disease are poorly understood. The reality is they don't know why. But luckily for you, I think I know why. And it tracks back to all of the lead arsenate, Paris green, and later on the DDT that was coating our food, our water supplies, and our bodies. These pesticides are known neurotoxins and could cause paralysis that they thought was polio. But that wasn't the central problem. That was just a sideshow to the main stage. Let's look at how the most common cases of paralytic polio arose. A young child, seemingly healthy one day, wakes up the next morning and can't move. They have paralysis, typically in their lower limbs, their legs, sometimes their arms. They can still feel things with their legs and arms, they just can't move them. This is important. It's why polio was originally called acute poliomyelitis of the anterior horn. Anterior refers to the front half of the spinal cord, the part that controls movement. This new paralysis people started seeing in the late 1800s was strange because you didn't lose touch or sensation, only movement. If you were in a bad accident and broke your back, you might lose movement and touch because your entire spinal cord had been damaged. With this new phenomenon, it was just movement, not touch. It only affected the front or anterior part of your spinal cord, not the back. Why? Geography. Shot here, paralyzed here. Tonsillectomy here, paralysis here. Remember that. The books will tell you that poliovirus gets into your blood and sometimes, for reasons unknown, will make it into your bloodstream, into your brain, past the blood-brain barrier, into your spinal cord, all the way down, not paralyzing anything along the way until it gets to the bottom of your spinal cord, where the poliovirus will then infect the motor neurons at the bottom, the ones that control your lower limbs. And here's the kicker. Only the neurons on the front of your spinal cord, the ones that control movement, not the back of the spinal cord, the neurons that control touch and feel, just the ones at the front. I don't know about you, but this pseudo-explanation seems completely ridiculous to me. I can't believe it. It's just not plausible. I kept going back to geography. Remember that the poliovirus is an enterovirus. It lives in your gut, usually without any problems. Let's look at some anatomy here and look at the geography of where the intestines sit and the location of that section of the spinal cord that controls the lower limbs. You know, the body part that typically gets paralyzed from polio? Are you starting to see it yet? We're fairly certain that some paralysis attributed to polio was due to the pesticides themselves. We know that the poliovirus can wreak havoc on the nervous system, but it never gets into the nervous system without an injection, or tonsillectomies, or one other thing. Pesticides like lead arsenate and DDT have a very interesting and very horrible feature. They wreak havoc on cell membrane function. They can make them permeable. Do you see it yet? When you get a poliovirus infection, it replicates into massive numbers in your intestines. Massive amounts. But again, nothing to worry about because there's no way it'll ever make it into your nervous system unless you're ingesting pesticides that break down the cellular membranes in your intestines and adjacent portions of your body, giving the poliovirus a portal into that specific part of your spinal cord, the part that controls your legs. The poliovirus could damage any of your neurons, but remember, it only seems to infect the front part of your spinal cord, the part that controls movement, never the back part of your spinal cord, the part that controls touch and feel. If the poliovirus was affecting your nervous system because it was traveling through your bloodstream, how does it miraculously avoid the back half of your spinal cord every time? How does it miraculously avoid the top half of your spinal cord every time? Your entire central nervous system is served by the same blood vessels, potentially carrying the same poliovirus. Yet most of it never has a problem during a paralytic infection. Just this one specific part, the front half, the lower section, the part that lies adjacent to your intestine, the exact part of your body where millions and millions, if not billions, of poliovirus are thriving. Every time you get down to brass tacks, there is confusion and wild speculation. Scientists don't know why the poliovirus started paralyzing people in the late 1800s. Some people will suggest improvements in sanitation had something to do with it. That might have affected the frequency at which you encountered the poliovirus, but it had nothing to do with whether the poliovirus would paralyze you or not. Some will suggest that poliovirus in the blood was somehow able to migrate into a very specific part of the central nervous system, while magically avoiding all the other parts. But even if this were true, why now, and not the thousands of years before? What changed? 3 polioviruses simultaneously? Some people will suggest changes in breastfeeding habits made infants more vulnerable to polio infection. But again, this would only affect whether they had a mild or severe infection. I would argue that infants without their mother's poliovirus antibodies to help them would have a more sustained poliovirus infection, and this did increase the odds that enough poliovirus would be able to make it into their nervous system to paralyze. But you still need a path, an injection, tonsillectomies, or permeable gut membranes. This is why a formerly innocuous virus began to paralyze people. It wasn't a sudden change in the human genome. It wasn't a sudden change in the virus. Starting in the late 1800s, specifically in 1892, 2 years before the first recorded polio epidemic in the United States, we developed a new type of pesticide that wrecked people's intestines and provided a way for a harmless virus to migrate into their nervous system and cause bad problems. Without that pesticide, lead arsenate, and later DDT, you and I would probably have never heard of polio or a polio vaccine. It would be an obscure condition that popped up once every few years during the summer when a bunch of kids got their tonsils taken out, or in the fall when kids were getting their shots for school, but nothing more. Polio is very clearly a man-made phenomenon. Remember how I said that animals were getting sick from these new pesticides, even getting paralysis that looked exactly like polio, even when they put the animal's spinal cords under a microscope? But animals can't get polio, right? Strange, isn't it? Historians tend to skip over this part because it's confusing. And remember when I talked about the mystery polio-like illness you see every fall when kids get their shots for school? The illness that paralyzes but is not polio? What was going on? Or what is going on would be a better question, actually. Okay, listen closely. If you still don't believe polio is a man-made disease, this may change your mind. It's what did it for me. If a man-made event, like coating the earth, food, humans, and animals with some newly invented chemicals like lead arsenate or DDT, if that did cause the previously trivial poliovirus to be able to paralyze people, wouldn't it stand to reason that this change might have also affected other viruses similarly? Even if you don't believe this was the reason that the polio virus started getting into people's nervous systems, just play along for a minute. Pretend you believe. If all the pesticides and insecticides we started ingesting in the late 1800s opened the way for the polio virus to get into our nervous system and paralyze us, might those insecticides and pesticides also have given some other viruses that same ability? As it turns out, they did. They gave other viruses that same ability. There were loads of them. There were all kinds of viruses that we knew nothing about that suddenly gained the ability to paralyze humans the same way the polio virus did. Echovirus, Coxsackie virus. They didn't know it at the time, but these other enteroviruses had also recently gained the ability to get into our nervous system and cause paralysis, just like polio. And it wasn't just human diseases. It was also animals. New paralytic diseases that looked identical to polio but had never been seen before in animals began to appear right on cue alongside their human analogs. In the 1930s, scientists began to notice mice with lower limb paralysis and discovered the TO virus. Within months, scientists also began to notice lower limb paralysis in pigs and discovered a new disease, Teschen disease. But like I said, in the beginning, all of it was called polio. We had no way to even see viruses at the time, so anything that developed paralysis suddenly, even animals, was said to have polio. And this mistake went on for a long time, even beyond the launch of the polio vaccine. In 1960, years after the polio vaccine had been invented, a follow-up study looked at a large polio outbreak and determined that over half of the people diagnosed with polio had actually been paralyzed by something else, something other than the polio virus. Over half didn't even have polio at all, but a different virus that had paralyzed them with the symptoms that looked exactly like polio. Humans and animals, all of them becoming paralyzed by multiple viruses, not just polio, all of them around the same time, the late 1800s. You have to admit, if polio wasn't due to a man-made cause, it would have to be a truly incredible coincidence for a number of different viruses in both animals and humans to all mutate at the same time in such a way to cause the exact same problem, paralysis. If you've never heard this story before, and I'm assuming many of you never have, I get it. This is very hard to accept. Polio, like a few other lesser-known viruses, was only able to paralyze because of something we did. And in fact, we are still doing these things in some parts of the world right now. That causes the completely trivial polio virus to paralyze people. It is truly a horrible tragedy when you see pictures of the suffering that polio can cause and realize that it could have been avoided. I realize that this is so different than what you've been told your whole life. For me, once I took an honest look at the facts of the story, it became impossible for me to believe anything other than polio, just like all the other viruses that began to paralyze humans and animals around that time, was a man-made disease.